The story of the passage from the Carolingian to the Capetian dynasty in West Francia requires a few years' worth of lead-up to the big events in 987 and the subsequent events thereafter. This video tells the first part of the story from 976 to 987. Such an introduction requires some context about the people, which I will give as we go along. This video could stand alone for the years it covers, but it's the first in a series covering about a decade in either direction of the watershed year of 987. First is the French or West Frankish side. King Lothair I was ruling between 954 and 986. He had a younger brother named Charles, who was not one to be outdone, and was what one might call in bed with the Germans. But this isn't the best way to describe it. There was a sense of one kingdom or the other juridically, but many lords' lands, alliances, and homages straddled the border between them. The political so-called border was also not the linguistic border, so lords on both sides spoke French. So to call it just the Germans that Charles was cozying up to is a bit off, since there were also French-speaking nobles on the other side of the border that were part of the same families and culture as those on the French side. Nonetheless, it is clear which side Charles preferred. Charles, in his jealousy around 976, accused his brother King Lothair's wife and Queen Emma of having an affair with Adalbert, Bishop of Laon. After a brief council near Reims, where she was found innocent, Charles went into exile at Emperor Otto II's court, where he found favor and a great ally. The most powerful man in the Western Kingdom was Hugh, Duke of the Franks, known to history as Hugh Capet. He owned the lands we commonly think of the medieval French kings as owning: Paris, Orléans, and Étampes, etc. His family's hold had been larger in the past, but had faced the same erosion to other lords like the Counts of Blois and Angers, just as the Carolingians had faced. The king himself had lands further north and east of Paris, with a center at Laon. Hugh Capet was a staunch ally of the Carolingian king Lothair. However, quickly this would no longer be the case. In the year 978, Charles, happy at Otto's court, was made even happier by being named Duke of Lower Lotharingia. This move was an insult to King Lothair, who found it right to invade Lotharingia. Even his name could have been his father's mission for his son's life, that Lothar, would retake Lotharingia. Lotharingia, specifically Lower Lotharingia, was the original starting point of the Salian Franks, so you can imagine its significance if they knew this themselves. So in August, Lothair gathered his vassals, among them Hugh Capet and Hugh's brother Odo Henry, Duke of Burgundy, and marched toward Aachen, where they caught Emperor Otto and his wife Theophanu by surprise, who had to evacuate, apparently in the middle of a meal. The eagle on top of the palace was rotated to face the opposite direction that it had been facing, but the sources vary as to which side this was. Originally, it faced either France to signal imperial ambitions to conquer it, or just the idea that it too was supposed to be part of the empire, or facing toward Germany because it should face the kingdom that held Aachen, Charlemagne's capital. Either way, it now faced the opposite direction from whichever one it was already in. Otto, gathering himself, held a meeting with his own vassals, who agreed to punish Lothair for this offense. Off they went, pillaging and taking towns, but oddly saving churches along the way from their own fury, according to one source. Arriving in Laon, Odo had Charles crowned as king of the West Franks by Bishop Theodoric of Metz. If their campaign were to succeed, at best, Charles would be king under the emperor, and Lothair and his friends subservient to the emperor or ousted from their positions. At worst, it would be a bitter slap of revenge. Town after town, they finally came to Reims, where we meet our next important character, Archbishop Adalbert. He was a son of Count Gozlin of Ardennes and Bidgau across the border, which already gives us a hint of his loyalties. He was also the brother of Count Godfrey of Verdun, known also as the Captive, and Count for a time of Hainaut, which we saw in another video. Another brother, Reginar's son, will be important down the road. Adalbert was already an aging man at this time, but energetic as ever in politics, at the head of the French bishopric par excellence, where divine approval elevated the soul through Christomimesis above other mortals. When Otto and company came to town, Adalbert unsurprisingly let them in and provided them with guides to help them navigate unfamiliar country. In November, Otto's forces besieged Paris. They ascended Montmartre, the Mount of the Martyr, Saint-Denis, and chanted Alleluia to call on God to grant them conquest by divine right. After roughing the place up a bit, however, they were chased back to Lotharingia, where, on the river Esna, they had much of their baggage train seized by the pursuing French soldiers, and they lost many lives. In 980, Lothair and Otto had a meeting where they made peace, which would last for the rest of Otto's reign until 983. One effect that this all had was that Charles, by invading his own kingdom, had proven himself a traitor and thus cut out from the familial succession, making him no longer eligible to become king, even in the event of no other heirs existing. After this brief war, there was a general peace between the two kingdoms until after the death of Emperor Otto II. He was another one of those victims of malaria after a failed battle against Muslims off the south coast of Italy. He managed to escape from the battle and died on his way back north. With this change in German king comes a slew of new people who join our story. First is Gerbert of Aurillac. The story isn't about his early life, so we'll have to gloss over it quickly, but it is still sort of dense. Gerbert of Aurillac was a monk from a young age, an oblate, at St. Gerald in Aurillac, southern France, as the name suggests. He was actually a monk at the same monastery that Gerald of Aurillac, the subject of my previous video, had built just a few decades prior. His intelligence struck a passing abbot from Catalonia who sought the permission of Gerbert's abbot to take the young monk with him. He was allowed to, and off he went to study and learn in Catalonia in some of the monasteries there. He may have gone to Cordoba in Muslim Spain at some point for some amount of time, but this is uncertain. There, or in Catalonia, if he had never actually gone to Cordoba, he picked up the so-called Arabic numerals, which are actually Indian numerals, and brought them to Europe where they were introduced using the abacus. Gerbert also picked up great astronomical knowledge. He wrote to some, like his friend Constantine, who was one of his beloved students at Lens, specific instructions on how to make his tools for astronomical observation. He was introduced to Otto I in Rome in 970, who offered him to tutor his son Otto II, which he did for a couple of years. He was in Rome again in 972 for the wedding of Otto II and Theophanu, and met there a certain Garamnus, an archdeacon who was known for his knowledge in logic. More importantly, Garamnus was a representative of Archbishop Adalbert of Lens. Garamnus invited Gerbert to Lens to teach the quadrivium there, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music, which he excelled in, and to receive lessons in the trivium, logic, rhetoric, and grammar, which he lacked in. It was an offer too great for Gerbert to turn down, so he went back with him with Emperor Otto I's permission. He taught at Lens for a decade, being basically the most intelligent man of his era. He was still there teaching during the war between Lothair and Otto II that this video opened with. He stayed until 981 when Otto II gave him the important role of Abbot of Bobbio in Italy. Gerbert arrived with so many belongings that it was said that he should have a familia, which refers to an entourage or living companions, and not a spouse like some like to read into that. The situation when he got there was not the greatest. Previous abbots had given lots of the church land in benefice, which was not uncommon anywhere in Europe, but Lombardy had a particularity about it called book leases or libelli. The benefice would be recorded in one of these little books and last for 30 years to be returned to the monastery afterwards. At the time Gerbert stepped foot in Bobbio, lots of these benefices had been secularized, that is, taken for longer than the 30 prescribed years into lay hands without any sign of returning. Gerbert, in his proactiveness, wanted these lands back, which put him in hot water with the abbey's tenants and leaseholders, or more like lease stealers at this point. Couple that with some monks who weren't the most disciplined, and you have a recipe for an escape back to his beloved Lens. That same year, Gerbert fled back, and that was when Otto II had died in northern Italy. Before dying, he had sent his son north to be crowned at Aachen. In a few hours or days after the coronation ceremony, the news arrived that the young Otto was now the sole king of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. Immediately in January, when Gerbert was home, he wrote to Bishop Nocher of Liège about keeping his oath of fidelity to Otto's family. On becoming the abbot of Bobbio, he had owed fidelity to the emperor, which he also swore to Theophanu and Adelaide, the queen and queen mother. Now both he and the archbishop were faithful to the Eastern Kingdom while residing in the Western Kingdom. Otto III was not the only candidate for the throne, despite already being crowned. His uncle, Henry the Wrangler, had been released from prison as soon as his jailer, Otto II, died. He was Otto's prisoner, not that of the owner of the jail, the Bishop of Utrecht, nor of the state. He did have a claim to the throne, being the uncle of Otto III and cousin of the late Otto II, making him the oldest member of the family, which made his claim good. So he abducted the child king and lugged him around Germany as he presented himself as king to whoever would listen, and some did. He surely saw himself as king, and presented himself as such in the ritual way these things worked in the Middle Ages. It wasn't about changing legislation, but acting as if he were king, making public his political stance. There was no better way to do this than to be welcomed in Quedlinburg in eastern Saxony and treated as king for Easter of 984. The nobles gathered, proclaimed him king, which was necessary for actually being the king. Gerbert, installing himself at Reims, set himself not only to teaching, which was his most prominent task, but also to writing letters, not only for himself, but also for his archbishop and as a mediator in negotiations between third parties. The letters offer us maybe the best insight into the events in this story because they are a window into the action of the man and his views and secrets, and they are in fact one of the greatest sources of information we have of the late 10th century. A lot of these events would have been lost to time if not for Gerbert's pen. In March 984, he sent letters to some monks at Bobbio. One to all of them, warned of the excommunication that he could pronounce for their disobedience as abbot, since he was still their abbot despite fleeing, and to another monk named Reynard, telling him to act on his own initiative, delegating him authority in his own absence. Perhaps Reynard held the rank of provost. He wrote to Empress Adelaide, reasserting his faithfulness to her, which is bigger than you might first expect. Since he was abbot of Bobbio, even if he had abdicated, which he didn't, he only fled, he had still sworn his fidelity to the emperor and the two empresses Adelaide and Theophanu, and now he was living in one of the top 3 most important West Frankish cities behind maybe Paris or Orleans. This continued fidelity is a testament to Gerbert's loyalty, but it would nearly cost him his own head in a few years. He writes a number of letters keeping up ties with various members of the imperial court. One such was a monk named Ekeman, another Lady Imiza, one of Theophanu's court maidens. Not all of his letters were from his own mind and heart. He was the secretary of Archbishop Adalbert of France, his great patron. Writing on behalf of Archbishop Adalbert, his great friend, he writes to Egbert, Archbishop of Trier, on March 26, 984, to tell him to not support Henry the Wrangler, which he was already wanting to do, writing, "Are there so few kings created that you wish to put a new one ahead of the son of your lord? Because, by chance, he is Greek, as you contend, you wish to institute a co-ruler according to the custom of the Greeks? Whither has sacred fidelity vanished? Have the benefits bestowed on you by the Ottos escaped from your memory? Bid your great intelligence return. Reflect on their generosity, unless you wish to be an everlasting disgrace to your race." He offers to let him stay in France and share the city with him if his turning away from the lion Henry the Wrangler winds up with him being incapable of holding Trier. The letter speaks for itself. Archbishop Egbert wanted a German emperor that wasn't a half-Greek. Gerbert assures him that the generosity of Otto II and his own sacred fidelity are more valuable than the fact that Otto III is half-Greek through his mother. He flips back and says he will disgrace the same Germans if he betrays his sworn lord. Maybe he was also using the Greek race thing as a pretext for supporting a politically advantageous Henry the Wrangler. It's possible. The next day, March 27th, again in the name of Adalbert, he writes to Archbishop Willigis of Mainz to support Otto III and to be open to join in an agreement between himself, Otto III, Adalbert of France, and the kings Lothair and Louis V. He pointed out that Henry the Wrangler had already tried to kill 2 Ottos. We know he rebelled against Otto II in the late 970s, which is why we find him first being released from prison in this story, but we don't know of any attempt on Otto I. Even though Gerbert was not very fond of the Carolingian kings, he still thought it wise to make an alliance with them to support his lord the child emperor. Gerbert was writing to the German bishops on behalf of his master to retract support for Henry the Wrangler, but Henry did not find just episcopal support. Charles of Lotharingia, who we saw at Otto II's court and then crowned at Laon and driving with Otto all the way to Paris, had too decided to betray the little Otto III, son of the man who gave him Lower Lotharingia. The same bishop who crowned him, Dietrich of Metz, decided to call him out on this. We have record of their spat, which was put into writing on each of their behalves by none other than our Gerbert. They called each other liars and betrayers, Charles also calling Dietrich fat. He had also apparently betrayed some oath made to Bishop Nocker of Liège. He goes on to call the bishop a babbling tyrant rather than a priest. The bishop responds, again through Gerbert's pen, that he can excommunicate Charles with the power of binding and loosing and send him to the pit of hell. On June 29, 984, Henry the Wrangler, without enough support among the Saxons and Thuringians, his support being mainly in Bavaria and Lotharingia, decided to stop his claim to be king and surrender the young king. Before returning Otto to his mother Theophanu at Roer, he went to Saxony and Bohemia to make peace with the nobles he had been at odds with in his push for kingship. Earlier in 984, Henry had also lost the support of King Lothair, who had been promised Lotharingia by Theophanu along with some hostages, one of significant importance in a little bit. The subsequent peace made between Theophanu and Henry, where Henry gave back the king, made Theophanu giving Lotharingia to Lothair kind of pointless, so it didn't happen. Lotharingia was to remain in German hands. There are fewer letters in the summer of 984. They are usually just concerning loyalty to Theophanu. One is sent to Viligus of Mainz, telling him to be loyal to the son of Caesar, and asks him to request the emperor to recall Gerbert from his exile, that is, from his duties in France, to go back to the German court which he longed for. He asks again in July a certain Robert of the Palace to send back whether he ought to stay in Reims or undergo whatever danger it takes to go to Theophanu. At Worms, October 20th, there was a formal peace made between Theophanu and Henry the Wrangler, even though the latter had given up Otto III back in June. But Henry would only be fully calmed down and loyal when he received his Duchy of Bavaria again the following June. A month earlier, in September 984, Theophanu, presumably, since Otto was too young to do so, nominated a cousin of Godfrey the Captive, Adalbero, to be the Bishop of Verdun, which was still in West Frankish hands. However, Dietrich, Bishop of Metz, had recently passed away, so he couldn't be consecrated. Instead, he was quickly nominated to be Dietrich's successor in Metz on October 16th. In November, Godfrey of Verdun, brother of Archbishop Adalbero of Reims, and his son Thierry, retook their city of Verdun that had been in West Frankish hands since the last campaign chasing out Otto II. Theophanu then nominated Godfrey's own son Adalbero, again, to be Bishop of Verdun, and here something happens that will haunt our favorite archbishop later. That Adalbero was a canon at Saint Remy of France at this point, having been sent there as a hostage by his family when Theophanu and his family submitted to Lothair's designs over their duchy, which of course came to nothing. You remember when Theophanu had made the agreement with Lothair to give Lotharingia to him and gave some hostages in exchange for his support against Henry, but then once Theophanu and Henry made an agreement, the deal was off. Well, those hostages were still in West Francia, one of them being this Adalbero, son of Godfrey of Verdun. Supposedly with royal approval, Adalbero sent this prized hostage back to his family at Verdun to become bishop, swearing fidelity to Otto III upon his consecration. On December 18th, Adalbero of Reims and Gerbert met with Bishop Egbert of Trier. Egbert held off on the consecration of Adalbero of Verdun since the bishop still favored King Lothair of the West Franks, and Adalbero's kinsmen fought against Lothair's control of Verdun the month before. In the meantime, he was made a deacon and then priest by his kinsman Adalbero of Reims, but it took until August 25th, 985, 9 months later, to be consecrated as Bishop of Verdun. A meeting had been planned between King Lothair and Henry the Wrangler at Breisach for February 1st, 985 to make an alliance. Henry had been without his puppet king for some time and was probably looking for a way back to power. Lothair had all to gain from an alliance with someone who, if he gained power, could turn over Lotharingia to him. Henry was a no-show, though, so Lothair tried to make his claims known. He was attacked by some local lords in Lotharingia, and he decided with the help of Odo of Blois and Heribert of Meaux and some of Archbishop Adalbero of France's troops, which the archbishop was obligated to furnish to Lothair as a royally aligned bishopric, to go retake Verdun, from which Adalbero fled to seek help in the area. Gerbert wrote to Bishop Nocher of Liège to not regard Adalbero of France as responsible for this military support, since he was forced to do so by virtue of being what we could call for these intents and purposes a royal bishop, and that his letters as royal secretary were saying things that he didn't actually want to say, but that the king was making him say. Gerbert even calls him a tyrant, despite telling someone in a letter a month later that he is to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, that is, obedience to Lothair. Remember, Gerbert is kind of a snake here. He's basically pretending to be loyal to Lothair visibly, but secretly always faithful to the German or Lotharingian side. He and Adalbero of France both. Gerbert kept knitting his web of alliances. He wrote to Siegfried II of Luxembourg, a cousin of Godfrey the Captive, being part of the large and powerful Lotharingian Ardennes family. He also kept up communication with Count Godfrey's wife, Countess Matilda, recommending that she remain loyal to Otto and Theophanu and not to negotiate with Lothair nor his son Louis. At the beginning of the siege of Verdun, Gerbert reported to Adalbero of France that he successfully made an alliance between Godfrey of the Captive's men and Hugh Capet, the sort of disenchanted ally of the king and commander of the West Franks in action if not in name, as he said. He says further that he told Hugh Capet that he, the archbishop, would work to renew his alliances with Hugh himself and his son Robert and Otto III. The siege was a tough one. Both sides used siege engines to break or defend the walls. With the hope of holding out, Godfrey and his allies had stocked the city beforehand, but Lothair ended up successful, and Count Godfrey of Verdun, his son Frederick, and his uncle Siegfried of Luxembourg were taken captive back to West Francia. Godfrey was already creating his reputation that would earn him the epithet the Captive, and this would not be his last captivity. On March 31st, 985, Gerbert was allowed to go speak to the captives Godfrey, Frederick, and Siegfried. He gave them encouragement and delivered their message to their family, which was an order to ally themselves with Hugh Capet. Before continuing, we need to take stock of our Attleboroughs to make sure the story makes sense going forward. They all stem from a Frankish nobleman named Vigeric, who, after Reginald I of Hainaut, unrelated, became the leading man in Lotharingia, which makes it reasonable that his family sort of takes over a decent chunk of Upper Lotharingia around the Verdun, Metz, Luxembourg area. Vigeric had a son named Attleborough, who would be Attleborough I of Metz. He is unrelated to our story since he died a decade before we began, but he's a necessary name placeholder. Vigeric also had a son named Frederick, the Count of Bar, and who was Duke of Upper Lotharingia. Frederick married a daughter of Hugh the Great and had an Attleborough of his own, Attleborough, who became Attleborough II of Metz. He was the one who was briefly selected for Verdun, but was quickly moved to Metz when Bishop Dietrich died. This Attleborough was actually Saint Attleborough, so we can respect him a little more. Vigeric had another son named Gosselin, who had two sons, Godfrey the Captive of Verdun, and our third Attleborough, Archbishop of Reims, secretary of King Lothair and patron of Gerbert. Godfrey the Captive had his own son named Attleborough, who was to be the Bishop of Verdun after his first cousin, once removed, switched to the See of Metz. His assignment to that bishopric would be a pain for his uncle the Archbishop. Lastly, we have a fifth Attleborough, the Archbishop's brother Reginald of Bastogne's son, Attleborough, Bishop of Laon, making him the nephew of the Archbishop. Attleborough was one of those names associated with clergy. In fact, noble families didn't just throw excess children into the figurative ecclesiastical trash bin. Just given their names, we can see whether they were destined to the church from their baptism. It's not 100% foolproof, but it's a great indicator. Another good one is Otto the Great's brother Bruno. Bruno is a church name, not a lay noble name, even if Bruno led armies and got into politics. There's also family names like Guy in Burgundy is another. You don't really find Count Guise, you find Bishop Guise in Bourges and Angers. So you'll have these visible uncle-nephew sort of dynasties in the church, where for a few generations you'll have lots of one name, because when they're being baptized, they'll be named after a nobleman already in the church in their family, just like the Ardennes family, which was Verdun, Luxembourg, and a few other places. And they all were naming their kids that they destined for the church after an Attleborough. That was just their name. Now that that's out of the way, we come to the first actual accusation of treason against Attleborough of France. Attleborough's nephew, Attleborough, the new Bishop of Verdun, the son of Count Godfrey of Verdun, who was currently in captivity in France. He had been a canon of Saint-Remy in Reims for about a year now. He was a hostage from the Ardennes family in Lotharingia in their agreement to recognize Lothair as the guardian of Otto III and new ruler of Lotharingia sometime before the failed Breisach meeting. Dated May 8th of 985, Gerbert wrote a defense of the archbishop, his patron, to give to the king. He claimed that the archbishop had already been given permission by Lothair himself to send Canon Attleborough home to become bishop right after his family had retaken the city from Lothair late the previous fall, and then followed by Attleborough to be made a deacon and then priest in the presence of Egbert of Trier, as you remember. Attleborough of Verdun had to defend his oath to the child Otto III to King Lothair that he made. He did so by claiming that since he had already made an oath to Lothair as guardian of Lotharingia, any oath given to Otto III was actually given to Lothair as the child king's guardian. Of course, as you should already know, this guardianship of Otto by Lothair was completely theoretical since he never had it. Only Henry the Wrangler and Theophanu and Adelaide were regents of the Eastern Kingdom. Gerbert lets us know in other letters that Lothair had already suspected him and Attleborough of treason, but now it was manifest, or at least he had a chance to act on his suspicions. To this end, he proclaimed a meeting to be held at Compiègne for May 11th to discuss the charges of treason by Attleborough and probably Gerbert too. It would have likely ended in a guilty charge and possibly by relieving their shoulders of the weight of their heads. The meeting began in earnest, but was dispersed when none other than Hugh Capet came to the rescue, tearing in with 600 knights to disband those gathered. Hugh Capet's presence, other than him being a powerful man, might seem unexplainable, but he had been at odds with the king for some time, and was also the man with the most power in West Francia. On June 20th, Theophanu and Henry the Wrangler made a lasting peace, with Henry getting back his Duchy of Bavaria. From now on, he would be a partisan of his second cousin king. This also took him permanently out of the picture as someone willing to buy Lothair's support for the price of a Lotharingia. The writing was on the wall now that Lothair had a wide web of enemies all around him. Links were now being weaved between the Ardennes family and Hugh Capet, whose strength could not be overlooked. In fact, they were already related by marriage. Hugh's sister Beatrice was the widow of Frederick, the Duke of Upper Lotharingia, making her still the Duchess. Gerbert let her know that she ought to make a strong alliance with her brother Hugh. Lothair, some time after the disruption of his Compiègne meeting, freed a couple prisoners, Frederick and Siegfried, but not Godfrey, who refused to grant the concession of his county of Hainaut, again showing his very earned name of the captive. On March 2nd, 986, Lothair died of a hunting accident near Laon. Some sources propose that he was poisoned. As unlikely as it may seem, Gerbert himself wrote his epitaph. The dukes met for the funeral of him, O Lothair, Caesar, sprung from the Caesars, whom every good man loved. The memorials of grief thou spread before us in the second light of terrifying Mars, because thou wert seen clad in purple. Emma of Italy, Lothair's widow, wrote through Gerbert to Adelaide, her mother, actually, about her husband's passing, and informed her that there was a meeting planned by Gerbert and Attleborough to meet at Remiremont on May 18th, with Adelaide and Adelaide's brother, King Conrad of Burgundy. Accusations began to grow at this time against the widow Emma. The rumor on the street was that she had been having an affair with Attleborough, the Bishop of Laon. If you've heard this before, it's because you have. It was the accusation that initially alienated Charles, in addition to his own jealousy, at the beginning of this episode, and now this is happening again. Her own son thought it likely enough to have her imprisoned in the same city. Gerbert came to visit her in her cell and wrote on her behalf to her mother, the Empress Adelaide, about her plight, how her son was now her enemy, and that she ought to instead consider as her own son her half-nephew Otto III. The Bishop of Laon had been pushed out of his diocese by Louis V, and he wrote to the bishops through Gerbert's hand not to celebrate any liturgy in his diocese. On February 15th, 987, Gerbert wrote on behalf of Attleborough to Theophanu, telling her there was a meeting planned on March 27th to accuse Gerbert and Attleborough of treason for letting Attleborough leave France to become Bishop of Verdun. This issue would not be let go by Lothair's son. He told her about the recent invasion of Louis V on Reims that the city was barely able to repulse, and the king's messenger told him and Gerbert to either destroy the citadels of Mouzon and Mézières, which were held from the empire inside the Frankish kingdom, and to make an oath of their desires, or to leave the kingdom entirely. On March 29th, there was a meeting planned by Duchess Beatrice at Compiègne between King Louis V, Emma, Hugh Capet, Adelaide, and Conrad of Swabia, scheduled for May 18th. Gerbert decided it best to not attend since Theophanu was not involved in the making of the plans, so he suspected some kind of trap may be possible. After March 29th at some point, Gerbert went that spring, as armies do in the spring. He went to Saxony to meet his knights from Bobbio, about to go on campaign against the Wends, but Gerbert couldn't lead them to battle because he had pressing issues in France to attend to. On May 21st, King Louis V died. He had a short reign and a quite ineffectual one. At least Lothair made a couple meaningful invasions eastward, one to Aachen, and he captured the city of Verdun and his enemies there. Louis V, Gerbert wrote, was more dangerous to his own subjects than to his outside neighbors. And with that, the Carolingian dynasty came to an end because Charles was out of the picture. He was deemed kind of an outlaw, not an outlaw as such, but he had attacked his own kingdom during the campaign with Otto II. So they decided to have an election. There always was an election, but usually not usually, often at this point, the next heir would be designated by the father, and it was sort of a formality at this point. Of course, there were a couple times where Otto I, Robert I, Ralph, they'd be elected king, but overall, it was, any other times, it was pretty much by heir, genetically. But now there'd be another election, and it would include a winner outside of the ruling dynasty. And it wouldn't have been exactly obvious at the time that this would have been a permanent thing, but it ended up being permanent. There's no reason for them to think that this wouldn't just be for like one generation, and then maybe Charles would somehow become king, or maybe his son would become king. He had a son. But it ended up being permanent, and we'll see that with Robert II being crowned at Christmas the same year, pretty much sealing for at least another generation Capetian control of the West Frankish throne, which would go all the way until technically the 1300s, but with cadet dynasties, everyone at that point, all the big princes were Capetians, really until Louis XVI in 1780s, 1790s. So what can we say about this? This story takes place at a time when the Eastern Kingdom was still dominant politically over the Western one. This doesn't mean that the Western Kingdom was weaker. In fact, it had more manpower from the Mansus and Manor to the counts and other lords. It had better collective training, which makes for more synchronized and skilled milites. The milites, the knights, had not by this time reached noble status, which would come in the next few centuries. I'm planning a video on just this topic at some point. Western Francia was more fragmented, so the lords were individually more autonomous and powerful. There were also more of them. But this certainly doesn't make the Western Frankish kingdom less powerful than the Eastern one if the two both mobilized. And as we saw, for example, Lothair was even able to take Aachen, then push a counterattack into retreat, and he was able to take Verdun. In the Eastern Kingdom, the kings maybe had more authority over the duchies and who owned them, and they had a sizable episcopal land supply to draw on for military forces. But to say the Eastern Kingdom was as developed or collectively strong or populated as the West is too far. Before the 980s, Otto I and Archbishop Bruno of Cologne were able to have some influence in Western affairs at points in dynastic weakness, but at the turn of the century this seems to have stopped, and in the coming decades this will reverse, and we'll see minor incursions like Baldwin IV of Flanders taking Annam, and even being given the imperial county of Alost/Alst, which I made a video on. And we'll see Otto II of Blois invading the kingdom of Burgundy he saw as his and not Conrad II's. We see the idea still that the Western Kingdom was still supposed to be a part of the empire, the Roman Empire, Christianitas. It's sort of dumb to say that the Roman Empire fell in 476. No one saw it this way. And it was still believed to be the Christian Empire at this time. And there was really no reason why, at least in theory, the Western Frankish Kingdom shouldn't be a part of the empire. Of course, juridically, it didn't end up being so, with the regional identities and borders, or borders being a little bit fuzzy, but you get what I mean. But the imperial title was really supposed to be universal, like when Louis the Pious' sons were splitting everything up, and the two younger sons that were left made sure that Lothair would get the imperial title. And it wasn't like the empire was supposed to just be Italy, Burgundy, and the Low Countries. It was supposed to be all of Christendom. And this sort of degenerated, it seems, over time, to where we get to our story, and there's the empire with its borders, and then there's West Francia by itself. But there's no reason why this couldn't be claimed over West Francia if they had the power to do so. It's just that the West was so more powerful, and really it couldn't be invaded like that, and there wasn't so much of a concern to do so, it seems. And obviously the West Franks didn't go and conquer the East to go conquer the empire. The Germans, they sort of stayed on their own. I mean, even if maybe they wouldn't even have been able to do something like that. That would have been pretty. It's not like at this time they could just go over there and turn the color of that country on a map the same color as them and rule over it in the same way. It would be immense, not only a project, but even just to control afterwards. And again, if nobody was really able to at the time, or no one really thought to, or had that ambition, then it's pretty understandable why it didn't happen. We see the introduction of some real intellectual juggernauts in Gerbert of Aurillac and Abel of Fleury, which I did not mention Abel of Fleury in this video. He is relevant in the next one, but he is still alive, around, and doing things in this story, just behind the scenes, I suppose. He becomes more popular later. Both of these, Gerbert and Abel, were at the top of the pyramid in their day, although Gerbert probably topped Abel by a bit. Education was ever increasing in importance for the clergy. Gerbert was inspired by and then went to not only take classes at, but also teach at the Cathedral School of France, where he taught bishops, abbots, priests, and monks who would spread out all over Europe. Fulbert of Chartres comes to mind, who might have discussed with the Jews in the city, or at least heard of their arguments, which we see the product of in his sermon against the Jews' denial of Christ's messiahship. There were debates, even just written debates, where each side would write tracts against the other, and you can find Fulbert's against the Jews. I have problems with it myself. It's a little bit, it's not exactly convincing. Not that I'm, religiously Jewish, but... And you can find Fulbert's tract against the Jews. I actually read it in a book. I forget the author's name. The book was, The Virgin of Chartres. It was The Virgin of Chartres, Making History Through Liturgy and the Arts by Margot E. Fassler, made in 2010. It was pretty good. I liked it. It had, it's in the appendix. You can read the appendix. There was also an interesting tract in there where he defends not only the use of the apocryphal texts, not like the Protestant apocryphal, but the actual apocryphal texts, if they have sort of a spiritual meaning at all, as a help. If it's not something that's egregious, like say Christ had a wife, but if it's just saying that in a similar way to how Christ went into Egypt in hiding, so did John the Baptist when he was a baby. His parents took him into hiding, something like this. And in that same tract, he also defended the Immaculate Conception, interestingly. So that's the kind of caliber we're talking about. He was involved in the construction of the cathedral there, even though it would burn down in a few decades once again, and then it would be rebuilt and strangely attributed back to him, even though it wasn't his cathedral, at least in most. Some of it might have survived, but not all of it. Some of the monks that surrounded Abbo went to Reims and kept up contacts with Gerbert. Gerbert also personally taught Otto II, Robert II, and Otto III. One of my favorite parts of history is the evaluation of the personalities of rulers based on the sources we have. And here we have an interesting trend where the well-educated rulers had an affinity for devotion, which we see in Robert II, hagiographically called the Pious, in spite of his marriage debacle, as well as Otto III, who was said to wear a hair shirt in penance, who visited hermits to receive penance for his bad actions and lamented over the death of his friend St. Adalbert, whom he had sent to die witnessing Christ to the Prussians. And he was, it's sometimes attributed, his death is sometimes attributed to his weakness from fasting. And I just find it interesting to see characters like that. There's some other ones. St. Louis comes to mind. Philip Augustus we can see maybe not the same devotion, but we can see his personality kind of shine through. Henry II, maybe, of Germany. Another question you may have is why we have so many of Gerbert's letters. It was common in the Middle Ages to make 2 copies of letters, maybe more, one to actually send and one to keep as a record. They would be recopied by monks in later centuries, ensuring we have them today. Gerbert himself kept them to keep receipts of who he talked to and what he said, so he couldn't be accused of something he didn't say by the German court initially, when he became the abbot of Bobbio. Or if he were accused of mishandling property at Bobbio, for example, he could show that he made an effort to do the right thing, even if things went badly. He certainly had reason to be wary of what he was doing. His letters actually mention the use of spies and intel who would be mentioned by just the first initial in the letters to conceal their identities to anyone other than him or the recipient. And he also had a solid mail courier network to be able to spread messages so far and fast. And you have to imagine, again, Gerbert was, I called him earlier, the snake. And he does have a black legend that pops up around him later on in his life. It's, there's some depictions of him as, there's actually one depiction that you see people post memes or whatever, like this is how people learn, sure, not great, but, and it basically has like the demon, and it's like there's like a face on its butt, and it's talking, actually in the image, it's supposed to be talking to Gerbert, I'm pretty sure. And there's something about him like learning magic in Spain and with the Muslims and making all this weird stuff. There was also a story of him in his intelligence, and his intelligence actually survived in the Black Legend. There was a statue in Rome where there was some kind of an inscription below it where it said that wherever the statue points, I think, there's immense treasure, and everyone was touching the finger and trying to figure out where the treasure was inside the statue, something like this. And then Gerbert, in his intelligence, when he was in Rome, he noticed that, or he had the intuition in his very intuitive intelligence. He basically said that whenever the statue points its shadow at noontime, I'm gonna dig there. And then he went with one of his just assistants at night, and they dug down there and they found treasure, and it was like a gold meal with like gold people, and then they tried to steal some of the stuff down there, and then I think they started like shooting arrows at Gerbert and his assistant. It's a Black Legend. I think it's in William of Malmesbury, I believe. Malmesbury, Black Legend, Gerbert. Yes. It's in the Gesta Regum Anglorum, Deeds of the Kings of the English, of William of Malmesbury. I'm not entirely sure if that exact story is in William's work, but the Black Legend and his magic in making deals with demons to rise from, actually, some say, relative obscurity, because he was only he was a monk in Aurillac, so he had to have had some social standing, but probably not too much. And again, like I said, this is before the Medites really take off and join the nobility. So he might have had some power in his family, but overall, maybe his parents were like Aladists or something. Maybe they had some land personally, and they were able to get Gerbert in. Because the only other option, maybe, would be that he might just be like a peasant, but it's not terribly likely, I don't think. And then he was able to rise as a monk to become maybe the single smartest man in Western Europe at the time, to become the assistant to the Archbishop of Reims, to then become Archbishop of Reims, which we'll find in the next episode, and then Pope himself, which I've already made a video on, all of his really universal ambition. This guy really embodies the universal papal ambition and scope. You'll see him sending letters to Norway, to Ukraine, to a lot of Catalonia, France, lots of confirmations of prerogatives, which was something that would boom that century, 11th century, and then even more in the 12th and 13th. So I know maybe you're wondering why I'm I'm blathering on about Gerbert, but he really is incredibly important to this story. And there are a lot of things that we actually would not know if it weren't for him, if it weren't for his letters being saved. Because he saved the letters. There were some people that actually had their letters saved by other people, like St. Anselm, I think. There were a lot of people who, his fellow monks, who would take his letters and make collections and that sort of thing. So, yeah, he's maybe top 10 most important people ever, really. I mean, maybe that might not even be an exaggeration. It might be pretty close. As a closing thought for this video on the event of the coronation itself, I found in my research actually an interesting article by, I have to give credit where it's due, even his website says to do so, so I don't get whacked for not giving credit. Here it is. It's Fraser McNair, historian from the Historian's Sketchpad. If you look up any of these kinds of topics online, you'll see this website. I've read some of the things before. It's pretty good. He has an article, and I'm not going to quote any of it verbatim because I don't have permission for that. But he basically makes this really good point that we've all heard the same story where there's a meeting at Soldi and Adalbert of Vence gets up and basically says, the hereditary right of the king is not something that we have, and this guy had some unnoble wife, and so on, and that the king, or that Charles, the pretender, was a traitor. And then this comes from maybe other sources, but this guy, Fraser McNair, he has an entire passage from Richer's history that he translated himself, which is again why I will not be including the translation in here. And like I said, you already know what it's about. But basically, and this was kind of an interesting thought that I never had before, that this is probably satire, because Adalbert is accusing Charles of Lotharingia of doing all the things, besides marrying, I guess, that Adalbert himself was doing. He's saying, this Charles invaded the Western Kingdom, and at the side of Otto II. But what do you think Adalbert was doing? He was plotting with the Ottonians and Theophanu and Adelaide against his own king, against his own kingdom. And then there's the part about the hereditary succession and how he says, we don't have the hereditary succession in this kingdom. We picked the most noble, the most good person for the job. But then Adalbert was the exact same guy who was defending Otto III, specifically because he was hereditary, the son of Otto II, against Henry the Wrangler, who might have been a better option at the time, and was the older member of the family, and was obviously more physically able at the time to do anything because he was an adult. And he also had all the support from Bavaria, lots of Lotharingians, bishops, and that's what Gerbert had to persuade them to give up all of their loyalties to Henry in favor of Otto. But then again, he's saying, so the same guy who's saying that hereditary rule is wrong is the same guy who is exactly supporting it across the border. So, and Richer has, I think I've read this before myself, he's often construed as a pro-Carolingian, and if I recall, I think he even left Lens after Hugues' succession, and he went to Blois, and that's why he has a lot of information about Blois in his work, and he records, say, the death of Otto I, the Count, and his illness, and he's apparently even at his deathbed, I want to say. So that was a cool thought that I appreciated, and you don't really think about that when you're looking at all this stuff, because it's sort of the accepted, I hate to say it, the narrative, but it's kind of the narrative that there was this moment where everybody comes to their senses that the hereditary monarchy isn't the way, and the true way is with the guy that they elect for being better. But, and as Fraser also says, this speech was supposedly said at Senlis, which is where Attleborough and probably Gerbert were they were summoned to face once again the charge of treason that Lothair and Louis V had brought against them. So he's at Senlis, and he's about to be basically knocked down for treason, and then he makes this speech, which is sort of ironic. And maybe even if he made some speech like this, it would be massively hypocritical, and we know that Attleborough's loyalties were elsewhere, even if he supported Hugh. And as Fraser says, they weren't even that close as allies, and like Hugh Capet even had helped Louis V invade Wales, or to attack it, even though they didn't succeed. They had a common interest in opposing the Carolingians, even if Attleborough maybe might have been a little closer to them than we think. But it still gives an interesting perspective that I thought was important to end the video with. So, this was a long one. I liked it. I'm also using my phone mic for the first time, which I hope that sounds better than my laptop, my HP laptop. This time I'm using my phone. It's definitely going to be an improvement. Hopefully people enjoy this video. So I'll leave it here. Thank you for listening to me talk about this, and goodbye.